Good evening. Welcome back to the Liminal Record. As always, grab a blanket, grab some popcorn, and let's get into tonight's stories. Encounter with a serial killer. When I was 20, I'd moved from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore, thinking the distance would help mitigate my habit. It didn't. Instead, I just ended up driving to Bmore every couple of days and buying several $100s worth of H instead of just buying less on a daily basis. In this process, I got to know a lot of odd people, some of them hacks. In Baltimore, a hack is someone who operates as a cabbie illegally. Often they take people into the city to pick up their drugs, or just charge half the rate of a legit cab driver. I had met an older guy at a Dunkin' Donuts in Dundalk who did this. Now, I wasn't in the habit of using hacks, but one night my cabbie went down a one-way street the wrong way in front of a police officer, and we were pulled over and searched. It ends up this idiot had brought a whole stash of pot with him, so we were arrested and sent to the BCDC. I was pissed. Around midnight that night, they released me. It ends up that not only had my friend admitted ownership of the marijuana, but the reason they'd used to search us, that his license was showing up as suspended, was bull, and my friend's lawyer had called them on it. So there I was, in the middle of Baltimore City, with no ride, nowhere to go, dope sick, and in the middle of December. They released the men and the women separately, and my friend's cell phone was still off at the time when I tried to call it. It ends up he had been released several hours earlier, but had left his phone in the truck. For anyone that hasn't had the pleasure of being arrested, they impound your vehicle. So if you're unlucky enough to get processed and released after 5 p.m. or before 8 a.m., you're out of luck re-getting your vehicle back. Not to mention another couple $100s in the hole. As I mentally ran through my list of options, I remembered the hack I'd met earlier that week and decided to give him a try. I figured that at the least, if he was still awake, I could pay him to help me cop and drop me off at the Greyhound bus station to wait out the night. Well, I called. And not only was he up and about, but he was also only about a 10-minute drive away from where I was being released. The fact that he was still up and about at 1 a.m. may have given normal people pause. I just assumed he was probably a crackhead or a tweaker or something, and I wrote it off as luck. Within half an hour he showed up, and I clambered into the long, gray sedan just to be grateful out of the cold and back on solid ground. Now, to give you an idea of the way this guy came off, the best way I can think to describe him is gray. Everything about him was just gray. His vehicle was a medium, dinged up gray. His hair was longish and a deep, solid gray. Even his power seemed gray. I remember he had the face of a postmenopausal woman, sort of jowly, if you know what I mean. Soft. In retrospect, the guy was creepy as all get out, but at the same time, he just seemed unexceptional. And really, in the drug world, there's so many weird people that you're forced to deal with on a daily basis that unless someone comes off as blatantly volatile, you eventually learn to just ignore the crazy. If you don't, you'll drown in it. We managed a cop. In Baltimore, there's always someone out. I asked the guy to take me to the Greyhound station, just wanting to get well and curl up till I could think about catching a bus. And he just sort of looked at me, looked down, then back up, and asked if I wanted to just go watch TV at his place until the buses began running. Looking back, I remember feeling a bit hesitant, but the man just seemed so unexceptional, such a non-entity, that I couldn't imagine him being a threat. And if I'm entirely honest, I just wanted a clean, warm place to get it on. I was well beyond dope sick at this point, and my all-consuming thought was just to get straight. Taking my silence for hesitation, I remember him telling me not to worry, that he wasn't going to try anything. Maybe I've mentioned that I'm 5'6" and 100 pounds and 20 years old at the time, and that the bus station wasn't the safest place for a tiny female like myself to be hanging out at 2 o'clock in the morning, that he was just trying to help. I thanked him, said sure, and we proceeded to drive out towards the county. To this day, I'm still not sure what direction we'd even gone in, just wherever it was he lived. It was about a half hour outside of the city, and that it was not in the woods, but in a heavily wooded area. As we neared his house, he started acting a bit strange. Not enough to set off alarm bells yet, but still. I'll never forget him saying that either the police chief of the county or the chief's son lived in the same cul-de-sac they did, that they were friends and the guy had helped him out in terms of a few predicaments, as he called them. The house was right on a lake, with a dock in the backyard. I have no idea what county this was in, and no one I've tried describing it to has been able to pinpoint it either. It was totally alien to me. We pulled into his driveway and I was shocked to see that his house was closer to being a McMansion than the hovel I assumed I was in for. He had gone to tell me as he parked and we walked up to the door that it had belonged to his mother, who had recently passed. Here's this ratty little man with a ratty little car and his ratty little clothes, and he's living in this extremely, well, not nice, but expensive house, driving around all day and night for pocket change and basically living at Dunkin' Donuts. I was more than a bit skeptical. When we went inside, the situation became even stranger, but at least more familiar, more in line with what I've seen of the guy so far. The house was covered in two things: dust and knickknacks. When I say covered, I mean covered. Every square inch of surface space was covered in tacky little porcelain angels and dollar store crap. Shelves, tables, the top of the ginormous old box television, even the kitchen was covered in them. The kitchen itself I only saw for a brief moment, but I'll never forget how even the sink was filled with things. They were the obligatory dollies that old people seem to have in spades, all of them coated in dust and discolored. I asked where the bathroom was and excused myself to go get high. I was getting pretty weirded out by this point, and I just wanted to get straight so I could decide what to do. I did my thing and went back to the living room, which was the first room you walk into when you came in the door. I didn't want to go any deeper in the house. I wanted to take a look at the lock on the door, create an exit strategy, and hope I didn't really need one. That hope was quickly dashed. The first thing the guy did was bring me a glass of water and a handful of pills. Puzzled, I asked him what the pills were for. He said, to sleep. Now it's 3 a.m. at this point. I have to be at the bus station by 6. At most, we have maybe 2 hours before we'll have to leave. I tell him I don't think it's a great idea since falling asleep isn't on the agenda, that we don't have time even for a quick nap. He starts to become pretty insistent that I take the pills. Believe me, if we weren't out in the middle of nowhere, not to mention it being in December and bitter cold, at this point I'd have booked. Instead, I sort of laughed and took 2 of the pills out of his hand, stuck them in my house, and took a sip of water and said, well, what the hell. Immediately he brightened and shuffled off to get another glass of water, which I had requested. Looking back, I shouldn't have even drank the water. I spit out the pills and shoved them in the seat of the sofa. This whole time we'd been talking about little things. Baltimore, local politics, music, nothing deep. At this point he starts talking to me about chemicals, about drugs. Specifically what sort of drugs will knock someone out, but not harm them. How much you would need of what for someone, say, tiny like myself. I try to act as if this is entirely normal conversation fodder. At this point it seemed to me that my existence depended on not registering how abnormal this entire situation was. I think my thought process at the time, and especially as time went on, was that I couldn't act as if I knew what was happening. That I couldn't act as if there was anything strange or alarming occurring. That he would be stupid to let me leave and let me live if he knew that I knew exactly what was going on here. I need to seem like a non-threat. The whole time we were having this discussion, by the way, the guy kept trying to get behind me. At one point he succeeded and started rubbing my shoulders. I just laughed, said I wasn't a fan of massages, and that I needed to run to the bathroom. When I came back, I made sure to sit on the sofa that was up against the wall. I'm looking around for a phone, but I don't want to ask for one, because I don't want him to know that my cell phone's dead. Yeah, another great stroke of luck. My cell phone had died about 5 minutes after I called the creep to come pick me up. Now this whole time, this guy's been pacing around the living room, sitting for a few minutes only to get back up again, walk back and forth, sit back down. He'd begun talking about his mother, how she collected these knickknacks, how she died of a heart attack. how she'd been thinking about renovating the house, but hadn't had the heart to make any changes to anything yet. So he says he wants to show me something. He wants to show me the upstairs. Why I didn't run screaming out of that place, I don't know. I think part of me was still hoping that I was misreading the situation. Maybe that the guy was just lonely and creepy and socially maladaptive. Not actually dangerous or anything. But here we have yet one more horror film trope coming into play. Creepy obsession with mother, and bizarre dust-filled house perfectly preserved in memory of mom. Down to the last glass she used while sitting on the kitchen table. And now the guy wants to show me the upstairs. He wants to show me her room. So I follow him up the stairs. At first he makes it obvious that he wants me to go up before him, but I wasn't having any of that. We get to the second story. There were 3. I never made it to the third, however. And turn off down this hallway, and he opens the first door on the left. He goes in. I'm half expecting to see the body of his dead mom lying on the bed or something, and I find myself seriously relieved when I find myself standing in just one more dust-coated room full of crap. I don't remember much about the room. I remember the bed was made, and that I couldn't tell if the comforter was dark, or just covered in so much dust that it appeared that way. He gestured for me to sit down. I obliged. What followed was the worst of the experience. He sat down on the edge of the bed next to me and began talking about his mother. After a bit, he looked at me and said, "You're so beautiful. You look like a little girl. I bet little girls really like you." I tried to lead the conversation back to his mom. He gets up and walks over to the far wall of the bedroom, starts referring to our earlier conversation about drugs and knocking someone out. He asks me what I would use to knock out a child, what I would use to keep a child knocked out for long periods of time, safely. I'm trying at this point to act as if I'm still on point, as if I'm not finding this line of conversation to be dreadful, creepy, and horrible. I tell him I really don't know. I'm just a dope fiend, not a chemist. He asks about heroin, and if that would be safe. At this point I've just had it, and I think he can tell. He says, "I want to show you something." I begin to protest and tell him that I have to use the bathroom, but he insists. He pushes on the cheap wood paneling on the wall and a large square that swings open. He gestures inside and says he's been working on it for a few years, that it's just big enough for a small woman, but made for a child. It's a sort of cot. There are loops on the ends for rope or some other restraint, I'm sure. I noped out of the bedroom, down the stairs. I didn't run, I just told him I had to go to the restroom again. While I'm walking, shaking down the stairs, I pull out my cell phone out of my purse and mimic dialing on it. I was lucky that he stayed behind to close up the bedroom and that thing on the wall, so he didn't see that my phone wasn't even turning on. I pretended to be having a conversation with a friend of mine, and at that point he showed up again, began loudly recounting what had transpired that evening to my friend. I told him how I'd called the nice gent that we had met. I'd been with my friend Tom the time we met the guy at the DD, at the Dunkin' Donuts to pick me up, and I was at that guy's house. But I would be leaving shortly. Then I pretended that my friend had offered to come pick me up from the bus stop, and in one respect I was lucky. The guy knew I was living out of town, but he didn't know I was living 4 hours away, or that any friend of mine would have to make a hellishly long trip if they were going to come pick me up. I told my friend that I'd head out to the bus station ASAP and that I'd see him soon. I still remember the look on the guy's face when I said that. It darkened. You know the look that snotty, spoiled little kids will get when someone actually dares to tell them no? It was like that. It was that look, but worse. There was something almost perverse about seeing it so openly displayed on the face of a 50-something-year-old man. So I started to grab my purse and zip up my coat, all while gibbering on about how my friend remembered him and had said to tell him hi. It seemed at the time that the two things were of the utmost importance in the moment. The first, to make him feel like I hadn't found him out or anything that he said or displayed odd. I didn't want him to think I would be some sort of threat to his plans or his well-being if he let me leave. Secondly, I wanted him to know that he was identifiable, that someone, at least someone who could identify him, knew I was with him. This is pretty much the end of the story, although I had one more, far worse encounter with the same guy a couple of weeks after this incident. He took me to the bus station and acted crappy the entire time we were driving there. The second encounter convinced me not only was I lucky to be alive, but I had spent several hours in the same home of a serial killer. Do I think he had done anything yet at the time I spent that terrifying early morning in his home? No. I think he was gearing up to, though. And by the second brief encounter I had with the guy, I'm positive he had. I don't know how to put it. That uncertainty that he had displayed with me was gone. I think by that point he'd crossed the line. If I haven't bored everyone to death and anyone wants to hear about the second encounter, I'll post it. In closing, I will say this. I did take down the license number as he was leaving that morning, and I did contact a friend of mine who's a police officer. A year or so after all of this happened, my friend called me and asked if I still had the guy's information. I didn't. He'd lost it, if he ever really bothered to write it down at all, and there had been several disappearances of young children in the very same areas as that guy. In our second, blissfully brief encounter, mentioned that he trolled, just scoping out the little girls. I did try to find the man. I began by going to the Dunkin' that he had hung out at. The owner, who said the guy spent every single morning there for a couple of years, told me that he had just quit coming the same week that this happened. And I think I finally figured out why he hung out there every day. The day I went there looking for the guy, I noticed there was a bus stop right in front of the Dunkin'. A bus stop full of elementary school kids. My encounter with a serial killer. Part 2. After my initial encounter with the Dundalk Creep, I contacted a friend of mine who was a Baltimore City police officer, and I gave him a description of the creep's house, car, his license number, first name, cell number, and a detailed account of what transpired that morning in his home. A year or so later, I would receive a call from the very same officer, asking if I still had a record of the info that I had given him. Unfortunately, I no longer did, and the owner of the Dunkin' Donuts on East Avenue, the Dunkin' he used to frequent, had no information on the creep. The last I'd seen of him, the creep had come by to show him a car he purchased. It was black and a sedan, but that was all the owner knew. I was on high alert for a week or so. I'd received a couple of sketchy calls from a blocked number, but nothing I could pin on the creep. Life went back to normal, my normal at least, and after a couple of weeks I was able to convince myself that I had exaggerated the entire encounter. After all, I was still breathing. So one day Tom and I decided to take a trip to the city to pick up my stash for the next few days. Usually when we went to Baltimore, we'd pick up about $500-$600 worth of scramble, 70 pills, IOW. This would last the two of us about 2 days, sometimes 3. I had a bad habit. On this particular day, we decided to pick up a bit more than usual. Why, I can't remember, but the entire trip was cursed from the get-go. We were late leaving the shore. There was an incident in the harbor tunnel that ended up backing up traffic for a good 3 hours. And by the time we made it to East Baltimore, my contact had dipped. I ended up getting in touch with another guy who sold out of Dundalk, so we went down to Erdman Avenue, which is the same Erdman Avenue the Creep's Dunkin' is on. And I had Tom park in the Goodwill parking lot so I could go find my guy. Most of my contacts knew Tom, but this guy I was going to meet was one of the paranoid hitters, and he wouldn't serve me if he even saw Tom's truck in the vicinity of where we were meeting, so I had to hoof it. I can't remember exactly where it was he wanted me to meet him, but I'm fairly certain it was on Dundalk or Merritt, one of the large roads that runs through Dundalk like a vein. Whenever I'm in the city and I have to walk anywhere, I employ the look down, look at your feet, never look a stranger in the eye, and if a car honks their horn at you, do not respond, method of minding my own business. A large part of the reason I do this, the unspoken reason, is because a lot of people will assume you're a hooker if they see you walking by. Generally, if you don't respond when they honk their horns and holler at you, after a bit they'll leave you alone. And don't forget the police, and the undercovers. It's their job to harass you a bit and see if you respond, to see if you're doing business or merely an unlucky member of the vehicle-less tier of society. On this particular day, I remember being more than a little spooked at the absence of traffic. It wasn't a nice day, It was overcast, gray, a standard January afternoon in Baltimore, but it wasn't abnormally bad either. There was certainly no reason for it to be so quiet. I was walking down one of Dundalk's larger roads. The traffic should have been steady. There should have been a few people shopping and walking about at least, but nope. It was just me and the occasional ragtag car. I was about a mile down the road from my meeting point with my dealer when a black sedan pulled up next to me. It was the creep. He opened the passenger door from inside and told me to get in. Now, I seriously considered altering the story at this point to make myself look like and feel like less of an idiot, but so far I've been entirely honest in my retelling of my encounters with this guy, so I'm not going to start lying now. Anyway, please cut me some slack. Over the 3 or 4 weeks that passed since the incident at the creep's house, I had spent a fair amount of time talking myself into believing that I over-dramatized the whole encounter. That maybe the little room in the wall with the cot hadn't been what I thought it was. In short, I had tried to convince myself that I was just a heroin junkie who had blurred the line between reality and fantasy. So when the creep pulled up and told me to get in his car, there were a lot of reasons why I did just that, instead of doing what a sane person would, and start screaming, running, and pitching a fit, and just generally noping out of there. I've tried to figure out why I did what I did that day, and all I can say is that between having convinced myself there was no way I'd actually experienced what I thought I had, and my dislike at the feeling that I'd been a giant coward, I felt sort of compelled to face the guy and verify that no, there was nothing strange going on, and that it had all been in my head. At the same time, there was another dynamic at play. The fact that I was still sickeningly afraid of the creep. I remember pulling back from the open door of the car and looking around, looking at the whole lot of no one coming and nothing on the street, and thinking that if I didn't willingly go, he could easily run me down on his own. I told him I was busy and that I was on the way to meet my guy, and he said that was fine. He'd take me the rest of the way and drop me off. That he'd even take me back to wherever I was going afterwards if I wanted him to. So I got in the car. I was terrified, and I fell back into the same routine I'd utilized the first time around, acting disoriented, high, harmless, and glad to see him. I asked him what he'd been up to. He said in a perfect monotone that he'd tried to call me. Why hadn't I answered? I explained that I used throwaway cell phones, and that I'd acquire a new one once my minutes had run out on the other phone. Now remember I said that I'd only been about a mile or less from my meeting point with my dealer when the creep pulled up. My hopes were pinned on him keeping his word and actually taking me to where I needed to go. If that happened, I thought, then everything was okay. I didn't need to worry. But of course it didn't. When he blew through the light we needed to turn at, I told him he'd missed my stop. He replied, "Don't worry, I'll take you where you need to go. I just want to talk to you for a minute first." I felt sick to my stomach. He pulled off of Dundalk, and I could see that he was turning into one of those little parks that they have dotted through the city. Parks with jogging paths and a few token toys and swings for children. If I recall correctly, there was some sort of school or other government building in the background. I remember thinking that as soon as he slowed down just a bit, I was going to jump out of the car. I also remember thinking that I needed to relax, that if he even thought for a moment that I was beginning to freak out, my chances of him slowing down or giving me any sort of out would be nil. You see, the whole time I was sitting there looking at the door lock, the area we were in, etc., he was going on about how he'd been looking up sedatives and wanted to get some Xanax and some other benzodiazepines. How he'd really like my help, and how he'd been scouting the park we were at, as well as other parks throughout the city and county, and how he was certain that someone like me by his side to help lure little girls back to his house, he could fulfill his dream. He said, and here's what terrified me the most, that he could use the dock behind his house to get rid of the bodies. I've never disliked myself more than I did that day. The whole time he was talking about all of this, I'd been doing two things. One, I had begun to slouch down in the passenger seat with my eyes almost shut, trying to act as if I had nodded out. I could only see him a little out of the slit corner of my eye. The whole time he was talking about this, he had been rooting around the front under his seat. Slowly, sneakily, as if he was trying not to make any noise, you know? So when I would respond to him now, I would make a warning gesture like moving my hand to indicate I was about to open my eyes. The last thing I wanted to do was make him feel like he'd been caught, and he had to pull out whatever it was immediately. The second thing I had been doing was how I was responding to his questions. Instead of acting freaked out or upset, I was trying to act like I was on board with all of this, but not too on board. I was trying to act like I was considering it, like I had the option to do it if I wanted to or not. I didn't want him to think of me as a victim, and I didn't want him to think that I was thinking of myself as a victim. I was hoping that if I acted like his peer, like a potential partner in crime, that he would treat me like one, or at least pretend long enough for me to get out of the car safely. He was still circling the little park when he began to slow down significantly. Through the slim opening of my eye, through my eyelashes, I could see him reach as far down as he could under that front seat, all while watching me intently to see if I'd move. I knew it was the time to get out of Dodge, because whatever he had, whatever he was looking for down there, he did not want me to know about it, and that terrified me. And God was I lucky. I was lucky because at the same time he was slowing down, another car had come out of nowhere and was slowing down next to his vehicle. He sat up. I bolted. I grabbed the door handle, fell out of the door, and ran without ever looking back once. I pulled my cell phone out of my purse and called my friend and had him pick me up in front of one of the stores on the corner of the avenue. I was bawling, terrified at my own stupidity, at how close I knew I had come to ending up in some psycho's dungeon. All because I didn't want to listen to my instincts, or hell, just pure common sense. I cried and cried and cried, thinking about the creep and all the things he said he wanted to do to little girls. This is, for all intents and purposes, the ends of my encounter with the Dundalk creep. About 2 or 3 months after all of this happened, I received a phone call one day. One I didn't answer because the number was unfamiliar. Later that week, I checked my voicemail, and it was the creep. He'd changed his number and wanted to let me know. Also, he had finished renovating the house, and he wanted me to come see it. He said he'd put an ad in some paper and was letting out various rooms as boarding rooms to women only, and that he'd had some interesting ideas he wanted to talk over with me. I forwarded the new number to my police officer friend and changed my own. Despite what I said earlier, when I told the creep that my number had changed because I used a throwaway phone, my number had never changed. I just never answered numbers I didn't know. And prior to our second meeting, had not bothered to set up my voicemail at that point in time. To anyone interested in pursuing this, over the years I've tried off and on to find the creep's house. Now with Google Maps, I may be at least able to narrow down the county. The Dunkin' he hung out at every morning for years is the one on Erdman Avenue. Google Maps shows the Dunkin' with the bus stops out front for anyone that's interested in checking it out. I still think the best bet is the owner of the Dunkin'. The creep hung out there for years, picking up business, drinking coffee, and talking to the owner. I refuse to believe that they don't know each other a bit better than the owners made out, or that the creep just never showed up here again. I can believe that he may have cooled it at that place a bit after our encounter, but I think it's almost a given that he'd gone back eventually. The only other point of possible identification I can think of is the cop the creep claimed to live in the same cul-de-sac that he did. He said it was either a police chief of the county or the chief's son. I remember him seeming to find that amusing, that he laughed about his friendship with the cop. But they were on the river. The cul-de-sac had to be accessed via a bridge from the main road. Beyond that recollection, I'm tapped. Anyone out there with addiction issues, you can beat them. I was a heroin addict from 19 to 25 when I picked up and moved overseas. For me, it took relocating halfway around the world to get far enough for my addiction to overcome it. But I'm going on 6 years clean this April, and I'm thankful that my life doesn't consist of the elements like the above any longer. If I can do it, anyone can. Thanks for reading.